The story begins with our protagonist, Lee, who had recently discovered that he was now in a new body. Although he didn't know how the hell this had happened. He explains that apparently he had turned into a character created by him more than 12 years ago, in whom he had embodied the personality he always desired in real life. By the way, the boy, after a while, came to the conclusion that perhaps everything happening was the fault of Arcane Continent, one of the best virtual reality video games, which had been quite popular among people all over the world in recent years. Or well, that was until it was shut down and appeared in the real world, turning various regions into simple scenarios from the video game. And of course, scenarios weren't the only thing the game brought with it, but also monsters that were quite powerful. Luckily, when everyone thought the world was about to end, some people assimilated their characters from within the game, obtaining all the abilities they possessed, starting to be called players who were capable of defeating the creatures and saving the world from annihilation. Obviously, our protagonist also wished to become one of those players, but sadly he realized that even if he awakened his game abilities, he would still be a loser. This was because the price of buying a virtual reality machine was too high, and his parents, who let's say had scarce resources, couldn't manage to afford one for him. So he had no choice but to forget about the video game. Of course, had he known his status in the world would depend on it, he never would have quit. But anyway, thanks to the little he had managed to play after his assimilation, he found himself at level 55, and worst of all, he hadn't even assimilated a standard game character, but someone created by him when he was only 10 years old. By the way, the name of said character was Granfell, who according to the story the boy had written for him, was the successor of a great family, but which had been massacred by some demons, causing the guy to make the decision to become a demon hunter to exact revenge. Furthermore, the personality he had embodied in him was someone quite cold with this attitude he had always desired, an attitude that, according to the protagonist, could cause him some problems right now, since the boy, despite having partial control over his body, could not control the way it expressed itself. It was as if he had two distinct personalities, something he couldn't explain fully, since according to what he had heard, when players assimilated their characters, they didn't notice such drastic changes in their way of acting. On the other hand, the protagonist, now that he had achieved an assimilation, made the decision to become a player. But since he didn't have much knowledge about the game, he used the internet to get information that could be useful to him, discovering that said players earned quite a lot of money in exchange for their services. Of course, doing so put their lives at risk, so he needed to obtain all the necessary information to avoid risking himself. However, when he wanted to check the information about demon hunters like him, he found that the rest of the players who had the same class as him had been massacred some time ago. In other words, he was the last demon hunter alive. Of course, for the rest of the people in the world, this didn't seem to matter much, since according to the protagonist, demon hunters had statistics that were relatively low. Plus it was much harder for them to level up, to the point of having to complete some fairly simple quests, like delivering bread, to get some experience. That said, these guys were far above the rest of the classes when it came to hunting demons. Unfortunately, demons didn't appear very frequently, and if they did, they only did so on the upper floors of dungeons. In other words, the demon hunters regularly stayed stagnant. That was why among the rest of the players, that class was considered practically useless. Or well, that was until some time ago, as the protagonist discovered that the new game update in the real world had brought with it various species of demons. Because of this, many had even been looking for demon hunters for those missions. Regrettably, they were extinct. This was because apparently, demons were vastly superior to the rest of the monsters players usually dealt with, to the point that many of them had lost their lives facing them in the new dungeons. Upon discovering this, the boy couldn't believe it. This was the opportunity he had been looking for to stand out as someone important. However, there was a problem. He had no combat experience, and he didn't even know if he could truly face the demons. Luckily, his new personality made him rethink things, making him see that he couldn't go back to being the same loser as before. It was the opportunity he had desired since the game had become real. So in the end, he made the decision to fulfill his role as the last demon hunter on Earth. And yes, that's how this webtoon begins. So if you're interested in this boy's story, stay tuned. Get comfortable and grab the popcorn because today, at present the player hides his past. After this, they explain how several years had passed since the cataclysm of the video game had begun. Fortunately, despite the fact that many things had been destroyed, humanity after some time managed to adapt to its new environment. However, there were some exceptions. People who were still dominated by their fear, and of whom the demons that had already begun to appear took advantage to use as their puppets. But anyway, returning to our protagonist, after assimilating the situation, he had joined a group of players to raid one of the dungeons. Of course, for these players, the cold manner in which the boy acted, in addition to not wearing proper armor, seemed quite strange to them. By the way, now that the protagonist had achieved an assimilation, he was able to detect the rifts that connected dungeons to Earth. Since apparently, normal people were not capable of perceiving them, and even at the entrance, this appeared underground troll warehouse. For levels 35 to 40, destruction probability 19%. Noting that the dungeon was suitable for low-level players, Lee felt quite relieved as it was a good place to start acquiring some experience. Remembering that the most advanced players who stood out the most for completing dungeons were those hovering around level 200. So he had to start leveling up quickly if he wanted to catch up to them. Luckily for Lee, there were also players with a level close to his. In this case, the guys who would form a team with him to raid the dungeon, and who treated him in a quite friendly manner. But anyway, once the whole team was assembled, their leader, who was of the tank class, informed them that they would start the expedition once everyone was ready. Meanwhile, Lee explains that every dungeon had a progress rate, which, once it reached 100%, let all the beasts inside it out. But anyway, once the group was ready, they set off. By the way, the atmosphere within these was quite pleasant, to the point that the protagonist wanted to fit in with them, and once their leader gave them the final guidelines, the raid began. Notification: you have entered the underground troll warehouse, food storage. However, once there, they noticed something was wrong. No monster had attacked them to welcome them. Although their leader told them not to worry, perhaps another group had passed through there not long ago. Despite that, Lee's instincts warned him that something was wrong. Moments later, the group finally crossed paths with the first monsters of the dungeon, immediately throwing themselves into the confrontation. Although while doing so, Lee noticed that the way the group was fighting wasn't the most appropriate. This was because none of them were fulfilling the role their class granted them. But in the end, he assumed that was how players usually acted, so he spent his time checking his inventory, discovering that he only had a silver dagger and a low-level bow to defend himself, so he had to survive until he found something better. Something that proved harder than expected, as a group of beasts launched a surprise attack. From the team's flank, the players from before were barely able to withstand the attack, and when they wanted to ask their leader for help, he abandoned them. Luckily, before a team member could be annihilated from behind, Lee sprung into action and, using the bow from before, quickly got rid of the monster. Despite that, all members were put against the ropes by the creatures. Luckily, thanks to the mental fortitude of Granfell, the protagonist was able to create a plan, protecting the team's mage with his arrows, while she gathered her energy to launch a large-scale attack. A plan that ultimately paid off, managing to greatly reduce the enemy forces. However, once they managed to get out of trouble, one of the players confronted their leader about before, asking him why the hell he had betrayed them. To which the guy only replied with a macabre laugh. Moments later, the whole place went dark, and the leader, with a terrifying voice, replied that he was happy to have a bunch of losers before him. It was then when activating the skill Natural Enemy battle power will increase rapidly when fighting, the protagonist realized he wasn't facing something common. He was facing a demon. The rest of the players in the room couldn't believe it, as encountering those creatures was quite rare. However, moments later, they ended up falling into a kind of illusion, where their companions were massacred, created obviously by the creature, to drive them to extreme fear. A demon is watching you. Your mentality is too low. Normal state: fear. Although what the demon didn't expect was that Lee would be the only one capable of facing him, since, thanks to his status as a hunter and his great mental capacity, he did not fall victim to his tricks. That said, the demon asked him if he would really continue launching deadly attacks, despite knowing that if he hurt him, he would also hurt his companion. But that didn't seem to matter much to the boy, who, after activating his skill, Natural Enemy, continued launching continuous bursts of large magnitude attacks, and despite the demon continuing to have the advantage, at the precise moment when he lowered his guard, The protagonist landed a cut right on his face. The creature, after receiving the attack, couldn't believe it. How was it possible that a simple human had the capacity to harm him? To which the protagonist replied, "Do not attempt to speak with me. I do not speak with my prey." And after those words, they show us a bit more of the life of the boy who had been possessed, who apparently was the older brother of a powerful player, and even a guild leader. However, his skills couldn't compare to those of his brother, who was a prodigy, causing him to receive mockery from other players all the time, who didn't even believe a loser like him was the brother of a legend. It was then that the demon took advantage of his insecurities to take over his body, after visiting the dungeon where it inhabited. And of course, after this happened, he had been luring players like the protagonist's team to destroy them. Luckily, the boy was still fighting against the creature, a situation that Lee took advantage of to continue connecting, attack after attack, causing him enormous pain. The demon even asked him if he didn't care what might happen to the boy's body, but the protagonist, who knew that his companion didn't want to continue living that way, didn't think twice, and ended his life after connecting a deadly attack. Of course, only with the life of the demon, since moments later, the boy woke up as if nothing had happened. Mind you, he didn't understand what the hell had happened. He didn't even know how he had survived the attack from before. It was then that the protagonist told the whole group this. "They told you, you don't have to worry, because I am here." And after impressing them with his epicness, he explained that negative emotions are what give demons the power to possess them, also informing them that some of a demon hunter's attacks only affected said demon and not its host. Of course, what he was seeking, by defeating the creature, was primarily rewards to level up. On the other hand, once the expedition ended, the news of what happened spread all over the internet, although most couldn't believe that a demon had appeared in a low-level dungeon, and even less that a low-level player had the power to subdue it. By the way, the guy from before used those rumors to convince his brother, the guild leader, to recruit the protagonist, and although he wasn't very convinced, he was shocked after learning the rumors were true, since the person possessed was none other than his very own brother. In addition to this, the guy also informed him that from that moment on, he would stop being a player to become a data analyst within his guild. Of course, he had reached that conclusion because of the words the protagonist had told him days ago, which had completely changed his way of thinking. And now he knew he shouldn't waste his life trying to become someone he wasn't. His brother was quite shocked by his decision, but also he was eager to meet the guy. His brother mentioned, since if he had been able to defeat a demon, his mental power must be quite high. That said, he didn't understand how a guy of that level had raided a dungeon for beginners. But anyway, after trusting his brother's words, the guild master had written the contract to send it to Lee. Meanwhile, our protagonist, after returning to his residence, verified that thanks to defeating the demon from before, he had managed to go up more than 12 levels. Right now he was at level 67. In addition to having obtained several experience points that he would have to distribute among his statistics. Despite that, his body continued to act strangely, acting very differently from how Lee used to act, living a much cleaner and healthier life than the one he used to lead. In other words, Granfell was the incarnation of what the boy had always wanted to be. But anyway, meanwhile, Lee remembered something quite important. The character he had created apparently had a special ability that allowed him to imitate most magical techniques just by observing them. So if that ability had become real, it would be quite useful. So he wasted no time and checked it by reviewing some videos on the internet. Although while doing so, he noticed the message the guild from before had sent him with the written proposal to join their ranks. But to avoid getting involved in anything serious, he declined their offer and immediately continued with his research, checking the web for various demonstrations of players using different types of magic. Meanwhile, at the guild, both brothers had received his answer, although they couldn't believe the guy had rejected them, since apparently, despite whatever good offers other guilds might present him, no player in the region would reject an offer from the Gyeon Guild, the best in all of Korea. So after a while they came to the conclusion that maybe Lee had been contacted by a foreign guild, which had recently been prowling the region. So before another entity could get the services of that diamond in the rough, the guildmaster asked his brother for some of the boy's traits to locate him. Despite that, the guy didn't know very well how to describe him, only as a quite formal aristocrat. Meanwhile, Lee after analyzing the magic videos for several hours, had managed to decipher the magical principle behind all of them. In other words, he now had the basic formula to be able to use them in combat. So now that he knew what his strong point was, he decided to distribute the experience points he had acquired among his statistics, granting 2 points to both his strength and agility, 7 points to his mana, and finally, 1 to his luck. Although while doing so, he remembered that his character didn't have much of it, so he increased it a little more. Of course, after doing so he went to bed, believing that things might improve, now that his luck had doubled, and luckily for him, that was so, as the next morning he discovered that a quest had been unlocked for him. Class quest, prelude to the counterattack. The protagonist, after realizing this, remembered that class quests were very hard to get, since they could greatly improve the skills of each player. So without wasting time, he started a search on the internet to find more information about it, discovering that very few players in the whole world had obtained one of these quests. Manny, even despite searching for it for quite some time, had not achieved it. So he couldn't explain why someone like him had been blessed by one of these, although, after a while, he came to the conclusion that maybe it was all due to his character being the last of his class. But anyway, once he finished with the information gathering, he made the decision to check what the quest's content was, being shocked upon learning it. Parallel to this, they introduce us to the institution known as archaeology, which was in charge of collecting and analyzing information about new game events to provide it to citizens, with the aim of reducing the damages that dungeons caused. However, while the institution's employees fulfilled their work as usual, they discovered something shocking. A new update had arrived in reality, bringing with it a new dungeon whose power levels were far above compared to those that had appeared until that moment. New dungeon: the Count's Fortress. Demon Bandits level 230. Beasts level 250. Count Soldiers level 300. Count Ashura level 430. All the employees were terrified. Currently, even the strongest player was at level 403. So with them, even if the strongest guilds gathered to clean the dungeon, the probabilities of winning were minimal, and in case the dungeon collapsed letting all its beasts out, it would represent the end of the world they knew until now. The Institute's director couldn't understand how a dungeon like that had appeared so soon. According to him, unless a miracle occurred, the world was lost. But returning to our protagonists, he discovered the content of the class quests, which included some mini quests to level up. One of them was strengthening his body by completing certain exercises. Today's goals run 1,000 push-ups, 500 pull-ups. Of course, fulfilling them was proving harder than he expected. After completing them, he couldn't even move his body from exhaustion, and the worst part was that he would have to perform said exercises not just for one day, but until the system stopped ordering him to. In addition to that, daily difficulty would continue to increase. Luckily, thanks to Granfel's pride, no matter how much work it was taking, in the end Lee didn't give up. And after a week of training, said system granted him his first reward. You have met the requirements. Reward strength 2, agility 2. The protagonist couldn't believe that the rewards for training were so good. This was because apparently increasing a single point of your statistics could cost a lot of money, and he had achieved it solely by training. So he was starting to look more favorably on completing his daily tasks. But anyway, once the boy was at home, he heard the news about the appearance of a new dungeon, whose leader was Count Ashura, a creature half vampire and half demon, whose current level was 430. The protagonist couldn't believe it. How the hell would experienced players be able to face him if one of the requirements to face demons was to be at least 10 levels above him? Even so, for the moment he decided not to worry too much, since someone like him who was barely at level 67 couldn't do anything. However, this appeared before him. Last quest: counterattack. Defeat the vampires. Upon seeing this, Lee couldn't believe it. The only vampire left currently was Count Ashura, and how the hell would he be capable of facing him? However, despite being terrified, thanks to Granfel's personality, his excitement to face a demon kept increasing, since he would be the only one to finish off his natural enemy. But anyway, Lee, knowing he had no choice but to face the vampire, discovered that the latter's dungeon was located in Russia. So his first destination would have to be the Mage Tower, which had a kind of portal for players that could send him to his destination. So once he knew the fastest route, he immediately set off. Meanwhile, at the Mage Tower, Several of the most powerful players had gathered to transport themselves to Russia, among them the Gyan Guild, the same one that had wanted to recruit the protagonist. Immediately, hundreds of reporters approached their leader to ask him what his strategy would be to face the new dungeon and if perhaps he was planning to team up with one of the guilds joining the raid. Although in a quite cold manner, he refused to answer their questions, since for him at that moment the most important thing was to dismantle the dungeon before it broke, as that was the only way for civilians to continue living. Moments later, some of the most powerful would take part in the battle about to be fought. On the other hand, the protagonist, who was also heading to the tower, although using public transport, used his time to continue observing some types of magic. Luckily his method was paying off. Now he could manifest spells, solely employing the formula. In addition to that, he could use them without incorporating them into his skill repertoire, since upon checking it he realized he only had extremely useful skills, and nothing more than 100 spells he had learned during the last few hours. On the other hand, a few hours later he finally managed to reach the tower where the portal was, whose power could only be used by high-level players. So only the most powerful were in said place. However, our protagonist managed to cross it after being pushed by accident, since apparently he had the power necessary to employ said method, while many players had to travel to Russia conventionally. Meanwhile, the Gyan Guild gave all players some basic notions of the interior of said dungeon, since in the raid, a wrong move meant losing one's life. Returning to Lee, he had managed to reach the place where the dungeon was, which had quite a cold climate. Despite that, he couldn't waste time to start his raid in solo mode. Count's Dungeon. Appropriate level 240 to 270. Collapse progress 9. Once at the entrance, Lee didn't think twice about going inside. Meanwhile, they show us how some guilds had started cleaning said dungeon, among them this girl here, Leonie of the Berserker class, and the leader of one of the most important guilds. But returning to good old Lee, he was finally inside the Count's dungeon, in which conditions were quite harsh, even more so for someone who simply wore a suit. Also, he immediately received a warm welcome from some demon wolves of level 230, a level that for someone who was barely at level 67 would represent annihilation. But for Lee it was very different, since he was facing his natural enemy. Skill natural enemy is active. Dogs of the Count, you chose the wrong target. It will make you feel the fear of being hunted. Hunting vampires, the hunt begins. On the other hand, while the protagonist faced them, they showed us how, like the latter, the rest of the guilds also had to face a huge group of wolves. And despite having the most experienced warriors, it had taken them quite a bit of work to get rid of all of them. Although they noticed something strange, unlike other creatures they had faced, the wolves had not shown a shred of fear upon being annihilated. Or well, that was until far away the group heard one of the wolves howling in terror. An event that left them shocked. Since what kind of creature would be capable of instilling fear in those beasts? So the girl from before immediately set out to find out. Meanwhile, the protagonist continued getting rid of the beast quite simply, to the point of even having started practicing some of the spells he had recently learned. Moments later, the guild from before showed up at the scene. Although when they did, Lee had finished off all his prey, and now found himself drinking a cup of tea in the middle of the disaster. The players, seeing his clothing, couldn't believe a civilian was in that scenario, reaching the conclusion that perhaps he was a reporter. The girl from before immediately scolded him for risking his life like that. But as always, in badass mode, the boy ignored her. The girl, infuriated, tried to make him see reason, but moments later a horde of demons showed up. Demon bandits level 230. Immediately, the players began the confrontation against them, and the girl from before turned into a beast, finishing off hundreds of them in seconds. However, catching them with their guard down, they fell victim to an ambush, and the numbers seemed to put them against the ropes. It was then that good old Lee entered the scene, who, testing one of the most recent spells he had learned, which consisted of using the mana around him to avoid wearing out his own, managed to launch a large-scale attack, wiping out the demons that had cornered them. The girl from before didn't understand how the hell that had been possible, and if it was some kind of alchemy, but the protagonist behind her told her no. It had simply been the ambient mana turned into magic, leaving her shocked upon knowing his skills. Of course, as expected, the girl still didn't understand very well how that boy's skills worked. However, she didn't have much time to think about it, as quickly her men alerted her to the appearance of more demon bandits in the area. So the girl immediately ordered the members of her guild to initiate offensive maneuvers before they could surround them again. However, at that moment the protagonist, just like them, decided to join the fray. But what caught the girl's attention was that this time, Instead of using his magic like the last time, he began employing a kind of arrows, wondering if perhaps he had a second class as an archer. If that was so, it must be a very experienced player. Although what surprised her the most was that the latter turned a simple arrow into a powerful projectile, capable of wiping out dozens of monsters, simply by invoking a little magic into them. Realizing that the protagonist wasn't lying about before. Apparently his class wasn't that of an alchemist, as she had deduced. In reality, he was effectively a mage, capable of using his abilities very versatilely, because of the way he fought. It must be a player at least at level 300 or higher. But anyway, after a while of combat, the girl's men, being helped by the protagonist, finally managed to get rid of all the monsters in that rift. So they decided it was time to return. Of course, before that, the girl would get some answers about the protagonist. After all, she wondered who the hell he was, since she hadn't heard anything related to him in the player rankings. So most likely it was a ranker hiding his level. But of something she was sure, had it not been for his timely appearance. Most likely she, along with her entire guild, would have been annihilated in the ambush from before, though she decided to approach him to thank him, even believing she would invite him for tea. And in fact, it didn't seem like a bad idea to her. After all, the neat and cold appearance of the boy had sparked her interest. However, she was frozen after hearing how the protagonist blew her off, since he wasn't even interested in starting a conversation with her. But anyway, parallel to this, we see how on the outskirts of the rift there were several journalists trying to get an interview from the guild that achieved the first clear of that dungeon. After all, those guilds that achieved clearing records usually obtained better rewards and even climbed spots in the rankings. So everyone had their eyes set on that place, waiting to know the first guild that would come out of the rift. Obviously the reporters were not only concerned about knowing the arrival order of the guilds having participated region of the dungeon raid, since according to some rumors about the advance in its percentage, since they feared that being at rift with very high level monsters, the players wouldn't be able to clear it, letting the beasts emerge into the human world. If that happened, the fate of the world as they knew it was doomed. Luckily their concern was dissolved after the first guild emerged from the rift. Of course, everyone was eager to meet the architects of achieving the first clear, believing it was most likely one of the top 5 guilds. But they were shocked upon realizing that they were wrong, since the guild taking the first clear was the top 32, Berserker. In fact, they didn't have any casualties, and their wounds weren't too serious. Of course, all that was due to the timely appearance of our protagonist, who tried to approach him to ask him some questions. Of course, he couldn't explain why a Korean was among the Berserker Guild, who were a German guild. However, he couldn't get a good answer from the protagonist, as the latter, annoyed by the way he approached him without showing a minimum of manners, replied not to test the limits of his patience, or he could pay very dearly for it. After this, he quickly withdrew from the scene, leaving his presence as a mystery to everyone. And well, we see how while this happened, they tried to interview the leader of the Berserker Guild. Just like the protagonist, she refused to answer questions, since she knew that at the end of the day, the credit for having obtained the first place in the clearing was deserved by the protagonist. So it was him who should have the honor of being interviewed and improving his status as a hunter. However, she was frozen after learning that the protagonist had disappeared from the surroundings without even saying his name. Something she didn't find funny at all. After all, she had wanted to stay in touch with that boy, who had proven to be someone very interesting. But anyway, minutes later we see how finally a second guild emerged from the breach. Although the surprising thing was that the latter, unlike the Berserker Guild, had received quite serious wounds during the clearing. And yes, as you may have noticed, said guild was Dawn, the guild located in the top 5 worldwide, belonging to the brother of the boy the protagonist saved days ago. However, when his leader was interviewed by the press, he was surprised after realizing that he hadn't obtained the first clear, and that in fact the guild that had surpassed him wasn't even in the top 10 of the ranking. But anyway, while the latter answers questions, the Berserker Guild decided to withdraw from the area to rest a bit and prepare for their second raid in the dungeon. That said, before leaving, the girl from before commented to the Gaon Guild leader that they were no longer the only world-class force found in Korea, referencing our protagonist. And well, minutes later, while members of the Gaon Guild recovered from the raid, they wondered what the girl from before had meant by saying they were no longer the only ones in Korea. After all, despite being surpassed by the Berserker Guild, they didn't even belong to Korea. However, the younger brother commented that maybe she was referring to a Korean player they had noticed. A boy with that description emerged from the rift. However, they wondered who it could be, since the only Korean guild, apart from them participating in that raid, was in 41st place in the ranking, and they until that moment had not yet finished the first clear. Of course, for a moment, it crossed the younger brother's mind that perhaps the boy could be the player he met days ago, but he preferred not to think about it anymore and focus on preparing the strategy for his second raid in the dungeon. But anyway, after this, finally, we return to our protagonist, who we see after finishing the first clear, had returned to Korea to take a well-deserved rest. Mind you, when the boy was eager to take a nap and sleep for several days, Count Granfel's personality prevented it, and instead he ended up performing exhaustively all his domestic tasks, until finally the protagonist had time to check his statistics in detail and verify the improvements he had obtained after facing the demons from before. And in fact, he realized he had obtained several quite valuable rewards, like a level 100 and E-forged saber. The bad thing about it was that for the moment, he didn't have the skill to use that type of weapon, but at least there was something that excited him. Since after checking his statistics, he realized he was now at level 86, having gone up 19 levels since the last time. Of course, for the moment that was a level extremely low to face the monsters inhabiting the dungeon from before, and he was only able to balance the difference thanks to his advantages over demons. However, he needed to level up urgently, since due to his body's limitations, he found it difficult to use more powerful magical techniques, despite his great mastery and knowledge about Manga. In addition, he needed to get more equipment, since he couldn't continue risking himself walking around with a simple suit. After all, he was sure that had it not been for the presence of the Berserker Guild, who served as support for his skills, perhaps he wouldn't have come out of the altercation unharmed. However, realizing this made Count Granfel's personality feel humiliated. So he decided to strengthen himself to the max before carrying out his next raid, and for that, he had decided to use his copy ability to simulate the skills of the girl from before. That way, he wouldn't have to worry in case he had to face a hand-to-hand fight. However, when he was preparing for it, the system informed him that to carry out said assimilation, first he had to focus on preparing his body by fulfilling some basic quests. Train your weakened body. Run 20 km, 1,000 push-ups, 500 pull-ups, 300 burpees, and well, after this, thanks to Count Granfel's personality, who was eager to strengthen himself, the boy had no choice but to carry out all the training, which of course wasn't proving easy at all. However, while days went by, he found out, thanks to the news that the dungeon from before had escalated to a rupture percentage of 95%, which made everyone worry. In fact, at that moment the most important guilds were beginning to prepare for the second raid in the dungeon, despite not having had much time to fully recover from their last assault. Unfortunately, they no longer had time to prepare, since in the worst case the rupture would release thousands. The monsters and alien casualties would be incalculable. In fact, many countries had begun requesting Russia to close its borders to prevent the monsters from reaching other territories, in case the dungeon reached the rupture point. Of course, the protagonist, thanks to his knowledge as a demon hunter, was sure that Count Ashura was using his blood to improve the capabilities of lower-level monsters in his territory. That was why the rupture percentage had increased so rapidly. So, worried about it, he came to the conclusion that it was time to join the action. Even though he still hadn't managed to master the skill he desired, but he was sure he could have a chance. After all, the said Count was his natural enemy, so he would have the advantage of being able to use his abilities to the fullest against him. However, before setting off, he made sure to stock up sufficiently on tea bags, as he couldn't risk running out of them. At such a crucial moment like this, time remaining for the dungeon collapsed 5 hours. But anyway, returning to the Russian Rift, we see how several journalists were in the area, trying to cover everything that was happening. Among them, this streamer here, who explains to us how the collapse rate was approaching 100%, and there were only at least 5 hours left for the dungeon to collapse, so that's why several top-ranking guilds had gathered in the area. However, the guy explains that this could represent a problem, since, unlike the first regions of the dungeon that had already been cleared, and which had more than 200 entrances, the deeper regions only had 30 gates. So the guild sharing entrances would have to fight each other for the rewards upon defeating the monsters in the zone, meaning everything was about to turn into a duel between guilds. But well, we see how the guy from before explained to his brother what was happening, and how it was most certain that he would have to compete with other guilds for the rewards. In fact, at that moment, the top 1 and 2, who had already started their raid, were competing against each other, to which his brother replied that they shouldn't worry, since as long as they competed with a guild that was outside the top 5, it wouldn't be difficult for them to hoard all the rewards. However, his smile changed after these guys showed up. It was the Inazuma Guild, the 4th place in the guild rankings, and to their dismay, they would also use the same gate to enter the Count's territory. This completely altered the plans that the Gan Guild had prepared for the raid. After all, those guys were practically at the same level as their guild, so having to face them while fighting to survive in the Count's territory would be an extremely difficult task. Even so, they didn't plan to let that affect them, and even the older brother ridiculed the Inazuma Guild, commenting that they would wipe the floor with them once they started the raid, and in fact he didn't plan to share even a single part of the loot with them. Obviously, all the reporters were anxious to cover the confrontation between 2 of the most important guilds in the world. Plus, the fact that 2 forces like those were about to enter the dungeon relieved them a little, hoping that they would manage to prevent the dungeon from finally reaching its breaking point. And well, after this, they finally started not only their duel, but also their raid into the dungeon. Inazuma, 4th in the rankings, and 5th in the rankings have just entered the dungeon. Of course, as soon as they entered it, the reporters would take charge of broadcasting everything happening inside, using some kind of drones. After all, they didn't want to miss any detail of the confrontation that was about to unfold. Furthermore, while Gan and Inazuma competed to cover more ground, the journalists explained that at that moment, those 2 weren't the only high-level guilds competing for a gate, since simultaneously the top 1 and 2 were also doing so, as well as the Berserk Guild of the girl from before, who had the bad luck of facing the top 3 in the rankings. But well, leaving all this aside, we finally return to our protagonist, who somehow had managed to infiltrate one of the gates without any journalist noticing his presence, and at that moment, he was calmly drinking a cup of tea before starting the job. By the way, the latter explains that he had found a new way to utilize his skills more efficiently, commenting that creating attacks on a large scale like in previous times put a very large strain on his body, which, being at level 86, he still wasn't able to withstand completely, so that's why he had decided to start using his magic, simply to change the structure of objects, and that way create attacks just as strong but reducing his energy consumption. In other words, using something like alchemy. And luckily, he had the chance to prove his theory after he was surrounded by a small group of soldiers of Count Ashura, who tried to catch him off guard. But this was useless against the protagonist, who had found a lethal new way to fight, using the very ground they stood on to turn it into powerful spikes that wiped out the entire group of soldiers in seconds. And the best part of all was that he didn't have to consume too much energy doing it, christening that technique as regression magic. And well, while this was happening, we see how, like the protagonist, the Gan Guild has started eliminating the soldiers of the Count, something that in fact was not proving very difficult for them. Their leader was capable of getting rid of dozens of them without major problems. In fact, he tried to do it in the least amount of time possible to gain an advantage over the Inazuma Guild, who were also in the surroundings. However, there was something bothering the guy. After all, the number of monsters, as well as their difficulty level, were very low for the zone they were in. Starting to believe that it could all be a trap, even a subordinate who had been monitoring the rival guild's movements informed him that they hadn't encountered higher-level monsters either. After this, both guilds finally met up again, and although they were still not on good terms, both leaders were worried about what was happening, as they knew something was wrong. And we see how at that moment the leader receives a call from his younger brother, who from outside had been tasked with analyzing the entire perimeter using drones, but upon finding out that his brother was in some sort of plaza, he ordered him to get out of there immediately. This was because they had just arrived at the territory of some beasts whose strength was overwhelming when found in the open field, the Count's Knights, level 350, and yes, it was due to the presence of those things that up to that moment they hadn't encountered monsters of a higher caliber. But well, the guy quickly ordered his men to prepare for the altercation, since with those things, one false step could cost them their lives. Unfortunately, the guy knew they had very little chance of surviving being in a situation like that. This was because the power of those things increased drastically when fighting them in the open field, since that way they had space to increase the power of their charge. Even the leader of the rival guild commented that for the moment, they had to put their rivalry side, or else they wouldn't live to tell the tale. No. Even though both guilds prepared to work together, the circumstances were still against them, as they noticed they had fallen into an ambush, attacked from various directions by the said knights. The guy knew that very likely everyone would lose their lives in that place. But unfortunately, they didn't even have an escape route anymore. So the only thing left for them was to go down fighting until the end. However, when everything seemed lost for them, the latter noticed that something strange happened, since out of nowhere, enormous stone pillars began to emerge, covering a large part of the terrain. Even those pillars wiped out a large number of the knights that were approaching the players. Obviously, the latter couldn't explain what the hell had happened and where those pillars had come from. However, at that moment, the protagonist, acting in an epic manner, approached them, and in fact, the leader's brother, who was watching the broadcast, recognized him immediately. That guy was the same elite player who saved his life a few weeks ago. By the way, while this was happening, we see how a streamer had infiltrated a dungeon to be able to cover in detail the confrontation of the Gyan Guild and the Inazuma Guild against the monsters of that place, without knowing that he was about to be witness to the appearance of a new player at the top of the rankings. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For their part, the players still couldn't believe that the protagonist had been capable of creating those enormous pillars with just a movement of his hand. If so, that guy must possess mana reserves extremely large. In fact, what surprised them the most was that he wasn't even using the proper equipment for a hunter. He was simply wearing a simple suit. Unfortunately, they didn't have time to ask him his name, since they were immediately alerted that more knights of that count were heading towards them right at that moment. However, that would no longer be a problem for the latter, since thanks to the pillars, the creatures had drastically reduced their speed and lost the only weapon that gave them an advantage over the players. So now the latter could finish them off, of course, not without thanking the protagonist first. After all, that was possible solely thanks to him. After this, the players charged against the knights, finishing them off extremely easily. After all, the latter decreased their attack power by not having good mobility to propel their attacks. So both guilds were wiping out all the troops. By the way, the entire scene was being broadcast to the world, thanks to the streamer from before. And of course, the protagonist didn't plan to stay arms crossed, so he continued using his new combat technique to create huge pillars with which he not only gave support to the other players, but also got rid of dozens of the creatures. The best part of all was that upon using that technique, his mana hadn't decreased in the slightest. By the way, both the streamer and all the people watching the live stream were shocked by the skills of that guy and wondered why the hell. Until that moment they hadn't heard of a player as talented as the protagonist, considering that with skills like those, he should be found in the high places of the player rankings. By the way, while he faced the monsters, the personality of the protagonist continued testing his skills to finish perfecting his new technique. After all, that was the perfect opportunity to put to the test the concepts he had learned, and, of course, simultaneously his level continued to rise rapidly, thanks to the number of monsters he had gotten rid of. After this, finally the confrontation ended, and while everyone celebrated having obtained the victory, the leaders of both guilds set their eyes on the protagonist, as they recognized immediately that that guy possessed skills extraordinary, so it would be a grave mistake not to recruit him for their respective guilds. Meanwhile, the one who beat them to it was the streamer from before, who after witnessing what happened, was anxious to ask him a few questions to our protagonist. However, the latter didn't have much time to do so, as the guy was swarmed by the rest of the players, who were shocked after witnessing his performance earlier, asking him quickly if he was a Japanese player or Korean one, as well as if he was already in any guild. After all, many were interested in having him as their teammate. However, at that moment the guy from before made his way through the players to present himself to him as Tyson, the leader of the Gyan Guild, asking him if he wasn't interested in joining his guild. However, the protagonist in a cold tone replied that he didn't see any formality in the way he had approached him, so he didn't plan to answer a single one of his questions, asking the guy to please get out of his way. By the way, this entire scene had been broadcast to the whole world, who watched in detail the appearance of a new ranker. By the way, besides them, we learned that the rest of the guilds competing against each other had also managed to clear the region of the dungeon they were raiding, although we see how the news of the protagonist's latest appearance had caught the attention of the guild ranked at number 1. who were very interested in the skills he was employing, as they wondered what class he belonged to. They even started to think if it was a good idea to try to recruit him for their ranks. Besides that, we see how one of the female players was very excited about the guy's appearance, as she found him quite attractive. Even more so seeing him using nothing more than an impeccable suit in the middle of the battlefield. However, the player most interested in the guy was this girl here, the guild's mage, who in fact wondered what kind of magic the protagonist was using when fighting against the knights, since she had never known that type of attacks, which turned out to be fascinating, and she was anxious to be able to meet him in person. Of course, that guild wasn't the only one watching the broadcast, as we see how the leader of the Berserk Guild was fascinated to hear again about the player she owed her life to. In fact, she hoped to have the opportunity to cross paths again with him in some raid. By the way, we see how many other guilds had already started to make moves to try to recruit the guy. After all, with his skills, he could be a very useful support in future battles. One of them was the leader of the Inazuma Guild, who had been able to witness firsthand the potential that guy possessed. By the way, while this was happening, the news reporters explained that even though several guilds had managed to clear another zone of the dungeon, there were still a couple more regions left that they needed to raid urgently. After all, the rupture percentage was starting to increase, and every time they were closer to the monsters starting to emerge from the castle. In fact, at that moment, many guilds were already raiding the next region of the dungeon. Meanwhile, we see how the protagonist, after finishing the confrontation from before, had returned once again to his apartment to take a shower and replenish energy. But while doing so, he could see on the news how the report of his appearance in the dungeon had become a trend. After all, many were impressed with his very characteristic way of fighting. And according to them, he didn't even bother to use equipment to protect himself. What they didn't know was that the protagonist didn't have any kind of aura effect. That was the reason why he always uses only his suit. But well, after this, as usual, the guy took the moment to check the rewards he had obtained after his last confrontation. And of course, what stood out the most was the first item he had obtained. First blood necklace. Effect sealed. And well, the protagonist, who had some experience regarding that type of items, explains that to be capable of using it, first he had to take charge of purifying it. However, the process could be quite difficult, as, for that he had to take charge of sealing a demon inside it, and depending on the power level of said demon, that would be the value that said object would obtain. However, while he was thinking about it, he received a new message from the leader of the gun. How did he ask like the last time? He ended up giving them the same cold answer. At that moment, he wasn't interested in any kind of proposal. Obviously, the guys didn't want to give up so easily. They wanted to find a way to convince the guy to join them, since adding such a large force to their ranks could boost them several levels in the ranking. However, while they were discussing it, they froze after hearing on the news how the dungeon of the Count had finally reached its point of rupture. In fact, at that moment, the vampire's fortress had already appeared in the human world. So the authorities had requested Russia to close its borders to prevent more countries from being affected by the dungeon rupture. In fact, many civilians had been gravely injured by the rupture, and that's considering the monsters hadn't even started to emerge from the Count's castle. However, when this happened, the protagonist, who had predicted that this would happen, showed up at the exact place to start the hunt against the Count, since that was the only way to stop the rupture and prevent the lives of thousands of civilians from being in danger. Of course, both journalists and players were stunned upon noticing his presence and seeing how the latter calmly entered the castle, completely alone and without any kind of equipment. He has entered the Count's fortress, and well, once inside, the protagonist had noticed that the castle facilities were larger and more terrifying than he expected. Even so, his knight personality prevented him from retreating. After all, he was anxious to start the demon hunt, and the first thing he could run into was a kind of statue guarding the castle entrance. And of course, once the guy set foot in its territory, the latter came to life to charge at him, leaving a scene that terrified the rest of the players who had been trying to enter the castle to stop the rupture. The latter knew they had to help the boy, since otherwise he would be destroyed by that monster. However, the fear running through their bodies prevented them, since they knew that if they tried anything, they would also face the same fate. What they didn't expect was that when the gargoyle charged against our protagonist, the latter didn't even flinch. After all, that creature was made of the worst material to attack him, Since yes, using his ability to transform the matter of objects, it only took a simple touch to destroy it completely. And the best of all, without having to spend too much mana on it. The explosion was so big that it ended up catching the attention of the #1 guild, who were in the surroundings, trying to enter the castle through another entrance. For her part, the mage from before, after hearing the explosion, knew that the one responsible for it must be the guy who caught her attention. So she immediately headed to the place to finally meet the mysterious player in person. Meanwhile, returning to the scene from before, the players couldn't believe what had just happened, questioning how the hell that guy had been capable of destroying a monster like that with just one blow, and even more surprisingly, he didn't even seem fatigued by the encounter. But well, once with the Gate Guardian defeated, the rest of the players, motivated by what had just happened, didn't hesitate to enter the castle to put an end to the rupture once and for all. And while this happened, a new notification appeared before the protagonist. Class mission has been updated. Class mission prologue of counterattack vampire hunt in progress. Make him feel the fear of being hunted. And, well, although the protagonist didn't understand very well yet the last point of the mission, he decided not to think too much about it and finally entered the castle. Of course, once inside, he noticed that the facilities were even larger than what could be seen from the outside. And the most shocking thing was a pressure, extremely strong, that could be felt throughout the environment, practically as if he were being stalked at all times. Luckily, that didn't represent a problem for the protagonist, who thanks to his demon hunter class, was capable of withstanding the pressure without many difficulties. Of course, unlike him, the rest of the players, who had also entered the castle using other doors, were having a pretty hard time. After all, the pressure was overwhelming for them, so much that they had to be using healing magic constantly to continue advancing. Still, they had no choice but to continue scoring the facilities, since otherwise the rupture could cost the lives of hundreds of civilians. On the other hand, returning to our protagonist, the latter, thanks to the pressure having no effect on him, had managed to score the castle facilities before any other player, finally arriving at the room where that son of a bitch of the count was hiding. And although the boy was terrified of having to face a boss of that magnitude, the hunter's personality was anxious to confront the count. However, before he started his fight with the demon, he was interrupted by the girl from before. She had managed to traverse the entire castle by herself, with the sole objective of finding him, commenting to him that she was very interested in knowing the type of magic he usually used. By the way, the protagonist was surprised that she was floating around the place like it was nothing, without fear of her mana running out, while he tried to work miracles to save the little mana he had left. However, when the girl insisted, asking him to give her a demonstration of his skills, the personality of the hunter in a cold tone replied that she should at least mind her manners when addressing him. Otherwise, she'd better let him continue with his job. Obviously, the girl was surprised. It was the first time someone spoke to her that way. However, right at that moment, they were interrupted by the appearance of a monstrous presence. It was the count, who had finally emerged from his room. Skill natural enemy has been activated. And while the said count, furious for being awakened from his sleep, commented that he was disappointed. After all, the creatures that had dared to awaken his wrath were merely simple inferior humans. So he planned to get rid of them promptly. Or that was what he believed, because at that moment the personality of the demon hunter was anxious to destroy him, and luckily he knew a way to do it. The cursed blood necklace has been activated. Count Ashura has been chosen as sacrifice. After activating the said artifact, the protagonist in a cold tone commented to the vampire that his minutes were numbered, as he planned to destroy him right then and there. And well, despite the words of the hunter's personality, the protagonist wondered if seriously he would be capable of using the vampire as a sacrifice to awaken the necklace. After all, that demon was above level 400. So the odds of being possessed in the said ritual were very high. However, after the count released a bit of his aura, which was so powerful as to make them retreat, he knew he had no other option but to use the ritual, since that was the only way they had to defeat him, despite the risks it entailed. So finally the process began, taking the count's mind to a kind of parallel space. Obviously the latter couldn't explain what the hell had happened and how he had arrived at that place. However, the protagonist appeared in front of him, since, with the ease with which he had managed to bring him to that plane, he was sure he would manage to seal him without many problems. The power of that necklace had turned out to be greater than he predicted. Of course, as was expected, the vampire didn't plan to stay arms crossed, so he was trying to break free from that place, using his best attacks. However, with that he could do little to nothing. After all, he was trapped in the protagonist's mind, a place where he could show him whatever scenarios he wanted, making the Count go through torture, showing him his worst fears, without him being able to do anything to free himself. In other words, the protagonist had obtained control of the fight completely. On the other hand, we see how outside the illusion, the mage from before didn't understand what the hell was happening. After all, from one moment to another, the Count had started acting weird, launching attacks everywhere, as if he had lost perception of reality, until finally she realized that the one responsible for it was the protagonist, who was acting as if he had everything under control, wondering what kind of magic he had used to put the vampire in that state. After all, he hadn't even moved from the same spot. Meanwhile, the Count continued being brutally tortured inside his mind. Of course, things couldn't be so simple, since while that was happening, the demon's body had been launching extremely powerful attacks, destroying large parts of the surroundings, and in fact one of them was very close to reaching them, which would have meant the end for them. Even the mage seemed shocked that the protagonist remained so calm, even in that situation. But well, knowing that at any moment he could be hit by one of his attacks, he decided to accelerate the sealing process, creating illusions even more terrifying so that the Count would finally succumb to fear. The vampire, Count Ashura, has been filled with fear. Make him feel the fear of being hunted. Mission accomplished. And well, once with the Count's power sealed in the necklace, the protagonist approached him to put an end to his life once and for all. However, when he was about to do it, something happened that wasn't within his plans, since after stabbing him with his dagger, he realized that due to the enormous level difference that existed between them, he caused practically no damage. So he had no other option but to ask for help from the girl from before, asking her to take charge of dealing the final blow. Obviously this shocked the girl, who questioned why he didn't take charge of it personally, since with his power that wouldn't be difficult. However, in the end she got the idea that simply he was doing it because he wanted to share the experience for defeating that monster with her. So in gratitude for it, she obeyed him immediately, destroying completely the vampire's body with one of her best attacks. And after that, the protagonist immediately obtained rewards for defeating the creature. Of course, having to share them with the girl, even so they were quite good. Your contribution to the Count hunt has been recognized. You have acquired loot for having a contribution in the hunt. You have leveled up. You have leveled up. You have leveled up. You have leveled up. And the guy had managed to go up dozens of levels. Even so, what surprised him the most was the power that girl had, since even though the Count was completely out of the game, eliminating him with just one blow meant that girl possessed monstrous power. And most certainly she was found at the top of the player rankings. But well, leaving that aside, a new message appeared before the protagonist. Class mission. Prologue of counterattack. Mission accomplished. You will receive a new class mission soon. But well, at that moment, they were interrupted by the rest of the players, who had finally managed to reach the vampire's room. Obviously everyone was surprised that the girl had defeated the vampire. But what caught their attention the most was that again the mysterious player was next to her. So most likely he had had something to do with the said elimination. However, at that moment in front of all the players, the girl acted in a rather respectful manner. She approached him and introduced herself as Jesse, to then ask him what his name was, to which the protagonist finally decided to reveal his identity as Lee. After all she had earned, after helping him with the hunt earlier. By the way, we see how the entire scene was being broadcast all over the world since everyone was expectant of what would happen in the Count's dungeon, so much so that the news even ended up reaching the sisters of the protagonist, who obviously couldn't believe that the latter had become someone so important. So after a few days of the incident, when the protagonist was at home, carrying out his household chores, he didn't stop receiving calls from his sisters, who obviously wanted to know how the hell he had managed to become such an important player. Of course, the latter preferred to ignore them. After all, he didn't usually have a good relationship with them. Since they were little, they always saw him as a loser. Unfortunately, he wouldn't be able to continue avoiding them, since the latter even showed up at his apartment to talk to him about what was happening. Although the latter were shocked with how much he had changed their brother since the last time they saw him. After all, not only was his physical appearance different, since the personality of the hunter took charge of attending them in a very good way, very different from how the protagonist used to treat them. But well, while this was happening, we see how the protagonist's name had finally become very well known throughout the world. So much so that many guilds were interested in recruiting him. Of course, that was a somewhat complicated task, since they had no way to contact him, and barely knew what his name was. But well, returning to the guy, we see how the latter continued attending to his sisters, who still couldn't believe that their brother had changed so much, and even less that now he was a renowned player. Even so, they asked him to be careful. After all, being a player was a very dangerous job, despite the large amounts of money that they managed to get, asking him to know how to manage his money and not squander it like it was nothing. After this, finally the girls left. Although their words reminded the protagonist that now that he was a player, his economic situation would change completely, as he had forgotten that players usually earned large sums of money for contributing to the cleaning of dungeons. So he was sure that for his contribution in the vampire hunt, most likely he would obtain a large sum of money. And although the personality of the hunter wasn't very interested in it, the protagonist was, since he could use that money not only to move to a better apartment, but also to buy the proper equipment to continue cleaning dungeons. That way he wouldn't have to risk so much in every fight. By the way, while this was happening, we see how the mage from before had been studying everything related to manners and etiquette, to be able to communicate with the protagonist without offending him. After all, with what happened the previous day, her interest had increased. Of course, she wasn't the only one, since the members of her guild were also interested in the power that Guy possessed, and that, most surely very soon he would be ranked by the association in the first places of the ranking. But well, returning with the protagonist, the latter, after finishing with the necessary paperwork, presenting to the association a report of what happened in the count's dungeon, finally received the reward amount remaining, shocked upon knowing the amount he had obtained. Finally, things were starting to improve for the latter. By the way, after this, we see how the guy decided to check in more detail the rewards he had obtained for defeating Count Dracula, which in fact were quite good. But what caught his attention the most was a kind of orb of Count Dracula, a kind of cursed item of a unique rank, in addition to the necklace he had used in his fight against the vampire to seal him, which after carrying out the said ritual, even though the protagonist at first thought that the item would disappear, instead its value increased. Now having locked inside it the power of the vampire, and of course Lee knew that at that moment the amount of money he could obtain in the market by selling that object was enormous. Even so, he preferred to keep it with him for the moment, despite currently not having the necessary level to make use of it. But well, after this we see how the guy couldn't even sleep thinking about the enormous amount of money he now had in his power. After all, he still hadn't decided what would be the way he would invest it. The first thing he had in mind was to buy a property, much better to live in. Although what caught his attention the most was using that money to equip himself with the best artifacts on the market, since with them he would have more effectiveness on the battlefield. However, at that moment he remembered that there existed an inconvenience for that, and that was that even if he managed to buy high-level objects, he still remained at an inferior level, so he wouldn't even be able to employ them on the battlefield. Therefore, he had no other choice but to continue using his characteristic suit to carry out the raids. Meanwhile, we travel to the Hunters Association, where we see how the logistics managers of each guild were holding a meeting to analyze in detail the facts of the Count's elimination. After all, they needed to gather all the information they could to create better battle strategies for future fights. Although, of course, what most caught the attention of the latter was the appearance of the mysterious player, about whom they knew absolutely nothing. Well, at least thanks to the female player from before. They knew his name was Lee. However, they wanted to discover more details about him and how his power were, since even though his skills were world-class, currently he wasn't even found in the player rankings. And the most shocking part was that his name didn't even appear in the game's database. However, while they were focused on this, they realized that the game had revealed a new area in its world. Arcana, a new area is coming to you. New region George Islands will be added. And well, we see how the news of this didn't take long to spread thanks to the news broadcasts, and they revealed to us that said region was a mysterious area that was known as Treasure Island when Arcana was still a normal game, and in fact its landscapes were beautiful, but appearances were deceiving. After all, the place, despite hiding all kinds of treasures, was also home to hundreds of beasts of a quite elevated level, and where a single mistake could cost you your life. And well, we see how the news of this reached the protagonist while he was carrying out his daily tasks to improve his level. Also, he found out that at that moment, a kind of magical conference was taking place, organized by the NPCs of the game, and which only the best mage class players attended. In fact, he could notice that the girl from before had attended, finding out in the process that that girl was in the 4th place of the player rankings. And now he understood why she had so much power. But well, after finishing his daily missions, he decided that he would also attend the said conference. Since maybe in that place, he could learn something useful about mana handling. Of course, before setting off he had to finish with the house war. And well, after that we are located in the Magic Tower, the place where at that moment, the said convention was taking place. And where besides them hundreds of players were gathered, who had found out about the news. However, according to an NPC guarding the entrance, only those important mages who would receive the invitation for it could attend the convention. Otherwise it was impossible for players to access it. In fact, many tried, but no one succeeded. Although according to the girl there was an exception. That mage who managed to find her. Tracking her magic would have the doors open to access the meeting. After all, tracking her was a very difficult task. And well, while the NPC explained this, we see how the mage from before crossed the barrier guarding the entrance without major problem. Since she was one of the invited to the meeting, and in fact the NPC usually respected her for the large amount of skills she possessed, taking charge of guiding her personally to the room where the meeting was taking place, and commenting to her that she was the last mage they were waiting for to start the meeting. However, at that moment the girl told her not to close the doors yet, as she was sure that someone else would attend the conference, and effectively she was right, since we see how our protagonist at that moment was arriving at a tower of which by the way he had heard a lot about. However, it was the first time he attended that place, although as soon as he arrived, he ended up running into dozens of players. The worst of all was that they recognized him in the crowd. After all, Lee's name had become very famous after he managed to defeat the Count. And obviously everyone hoped to be able to exchange a few words with the guy. Although while the latter was boarded by dozens of players, the Count's personality was able to notice a strange presence in one of the facility's walls, so he didn't hesitate to approach to realize what it was about, and effectively upon approaching, he managed to cross the protective barrier and find the entities from before. Of course, leaving her shocked in the process, since it was the first time someone managed to notice her presence without having an invitation for the conference. And well, we see how the girl who was shocked with the boy's skills had no other choice but to guide him to the room where at that moment the conference was taking place. Although, of course, she wondered who that mysterious guy was, since she had never heard of a mage like him. And of course, his appearance quickly caught her attention, while for his part, the protagonist was more shocked by the type of magic they used in that place, using a kind of steps of pure mana to move to the conference. Remember this because it will be important a little later. And well, after a while, they finally arrived at the Crystal Castle, the place where the best mages of the ranking were gathered at that moment. By the way, before listening to the conference, the protagonist explains to us how after Arcana became reality, just like monsters had appeared in the human world, a kind of steps of Manakuro to get to the conference. Remember this because it will be important a little further on. And well, after a while, finally they arrived at the Castle of Crystal, the place where the top-ranked magicians were gathered at that moment. By the way, before listening to the lecture, the protagonist explains how, after Arcana became reality just as the monsters had appeared in the human world, the NPCs did it too. And although many of them were simply filler characters, many others like Marcelo, the mage leading the meeting, were in charge of helping the players in some way. And by the way, Sid, mage was a kind of genius who, even at that moment, was working on a new spell and wanted to share his progress with the players who had attended the conference. Unfortunately, his magic was so advanced that no one, not even the girl from before, was able to understand how it worked. And well, said spell consisted mainly of using the principles of science, including the absurd power of magic, to achieve a very powerful explosive force. However, he still hadn't managed to perfect it completely, and for the moment he could barely create a small sphere. However, said sphere contained overwhelming power. Nonetheless, when he was giving the details of his discovery, he was interrupted by a player in the audience, who was none other than our protagonist, who unlike the rest of the players, had understood the subject perfectly, even commenting to him that as impressive as his discovery was, at that moment he could notice that the balance between science and magic was still inexact. Of course, hearing those words stunned not only the mage, but also the rest of the players who were waiting expectantly in the room, as they couldn't believe someone had dared to question Marcelo. For his part, the latter, in a cold tone, asked the protagonist to explain how he had arrived at that conclusion, to which the protagonist replied that he could simply notice the error, because he had also created a similar spell, and just like him, he still hadn't managed to make the balance between magic and science exact. So his spell was still not perfect. Witnessing this scene stunned the famous mage, who couldn't believe a player was carrying out research as advanced as his own. By the way, both the mage and the players were shocked. They couldn't believe that this boy had been able to replicate the demonstration spell so easily. Realizing that this boy was the player everyone had been talking about in recent weeks, the one responsible for taking care of Count Dracula. Anyway, we see how, after that, the mage asked the boy if he was willing to work alongside him on the research he was conducting. Mission Mage's research. Head of the Magic Tower wants you to join him in the next stage of magic. Reject accept. Obviously, the protagonist didn't hesitate to accept the mission, as he knew that at that moment, this request fit him like a glove. Meanwhile, we see how in the new game area, many players began arriving at the island to start clearing the place, including the members of the Berserk Guild, whose leader hoped to meet Lee again. Of course, they weren't the only important guild that had reached the perimeter, as we see how in that place, there were several top-ranked guilds, such as the Lion Knights, or the Shadow Mercenaries. But anyway, we see how the leader of the Berserk Guild found out, thanks to the rumors that had spread about how the protagonist had dared to contradict the head mage during the conference, believing that perhaps he would receive punishment for his impertinence. But he was stunned to find out that instead, now the protagonist was part of the mage's research, having access to both information and very valuable items. And well, returning to the latter, we see how he finally signed the collaboration contract with the Mage Tower, and what caught his attention most was that thanks to this, he would have unlimited access to very valuable items. But anyway, after this, we see how Marcelo was summoned by one of the leaders of the Magic Tower, who questioned why he had invited a player to his research without the consent of his superiors. After all, according to the laws, it was totally forbidden for MPs to directly benefit any player. However, Marcelo replied that he had not reached that agreement with the objective of helping that boy. Instead, it was he who needed his help to complete his research, as the boy's knowledge was so great that none of the other indices could rival him in terms of magical knowledge. And of course, after hearing this, the man had no choice but to allow Marcelo to continue working alongside the protagonist. After this, while the mage was leaving the room, he was surprised by the girl from before, who informed him that just as he had asked, she had taken care of gathering the artifacts that the protagonist had requested for his research, even offering to take them to the boy personally. As like I told you, she had become very interested in Lee and wanted to take the opportunity to spend some time with him. However, the mage told her that he planned to deliver them himself, as he still had some matters to resolve with the boy. And well, a moment later, he finally delivered to Lee the artifacts he had requested, which obviously had a huge market value, and were very difficult to get. To clear the dungeons, obviously, the protagonist was surprised to have such treasure in front of him. For his part, the mage questioned if he was satisfied with that material. However, there was a small problem. Those artifacts had an extremely high level, and therefore, only those players at least at level 600 were capable of manipulating them, so obviously, the boy had no way to even get close to them. That's why the personality of the Count, in a cold tone, replied to the mage, asking if he really thought those artifacts were at his level. Obviously, hearing this stunned the man, who now knew he had underestimated the protagonist. After all, he also believed that those artifacts fell short for carrying out such an important investigation. For that same reason, he had moved his contacts to obtain one of the tower's most valuable objects. It was his brook, right here, which had the ability to recover 10% of magic power when consuming too much mana, and the best of all was that any player, regardless of what level they had, could manipulate it. So finally, the protagonist had obtained an object that could be useful to him. Of course, for the moment, Marcelo told Lee that now that he already had the necessary materials to carry out the investigation, he could go home to rest. Furthermore, he was sure that he planned to participate in the raid on the new area of the game, so he didn't want to take up any more of his time, and would get in touch with him when he had made some progress in the investigation. But anyway, leaving that aside, we see how on the islands that had just appeared, the rest of the important guilds began to make their presence known, as besides clearing the dungeon, they were being drawn by the amount of treasure that could be found in that place. Of course, some reporters who were in the area, broadcasting the event, like this boy right here, wondered when the great Lee would show up, since all his viewers were waiting for his appearance. Nonetheless, he was surprised by this player right here, who apparently was very interested in knowing the protagonist's abilities, and they explained that this guy belonged to a kind of dark guild that was known for ending the lives of other players that they crossed paths with during raids. The worst part was that they couldn't do anything against them, as they couldn't find evidence that incriminated them while inside the dungeons. And well, this last guy left a message for the reporter to broadcast. to the protagonist in case he ran into him, telling him that he and his guild would be after him, so he'd better watch out. Although we see how, contrary to what everyone believed, the protagonist had no intention of attending the famous raid. And for the first time, the personality of the Duke and that of the protagonist had agreed on it. As they explained that inside the said island they wouldn't run into any demons, the only monsters against which they were effective. Instead, the place was filled with high-level beasts, like level 390 sand scorpions, or level 400 giant bats, against which they stood no chance at their current level. So going to that place would be a waste of time for them. Instead, they would stay to continue the investigation, to try to perfect the new technique. Nonetheless, at that moment, a new notification appeared before them. Class mission. Earth. The curtain rises, and the lighthouse lights up. The last demon hunter illuminates the world covered in evil. Investigate the evil on the George Islands in progress. Yes, after this message, the boy had no choice but to attend the said raid. Luckily, according to the system, on said island he would have to face the 7 deadly sins, which were incarnations of demons, and therefore his abilities would indeed be effective against them. So after finding out about this, although the protagonist's personality was not very convinced about going to the island, the Count didn't hesitate to set off for that territory. Of course, not without first stocking up sufficiently on tea bags. And well, after that, we moved to the islands where the players in the area were shocked when the person they had been waiting for so long made his presence known. Yes, our protagonist had finally arrived at the territory. Of course, we see how the latter was carrying the artifact that Marcelo gave him, since with it he would avoid the risk of running out of mana in the middle of a major confrontation. Nonetheless, as soon as he set foot on the island, a system notification appeared before him. A monstrous presence lurks on the island. Skill natural enemy has been activated. Obviously, this notification, instead of upsetting the boy, seemed to please him, as now that the island was surrounded by a demonic aura, his natural enemy skill would be active at all times, and he wouldn't have any trouble facing enemies like the monsters mentioned before, even though they weren't demons. But anyway, after this, the raid on the islands finally began. And in fact, he was being followed closely by a fairly well-known streamer who wanted to broadcast to his viewers the way the protagonist got rid of the beasts, while we see how the latter was wishing with all his might to encounter a sand scorpion, as above all, it was the lowest level monster in the area, and it was best to increase his level by hunting monsters like that before facing more dangerous threats. But to his bad luck, while walking through the place, he ended up crossing paths with this player right here, who had been pushed against the ropes by a creature of the island, and was trying to find a gap to escape and reunite with his guild. By the way, the beast chasing him was none other than a level 420 emerald tiger, the most powerful monster in the area. So Lee's plans had gone down the drain. But anyway, we see how the player from before, noticing the protagonist's presence, felt relieved. After all, he had heard the rumors going around about the boy's skill. So the protagonist had no choice but to help him and take part in the confrontation. Of course, he knew that this beast was not an easy opponent to face. After all, it was only 4 levels below Count Dracula. For that same reason, he decided to employ a technique he had been working on in the last few hours. Yes, Marcelo's technique, which despite being imperfect, contained overwhelming power, being able to blow the creature to pieces with just one impact. Obviously, the scene and the raw power the boy had demonstrated impressed not only the player and the streamer, but also all the viewers watching the broadcast, who were able to witness a personal ahead. Greatly was assured that your contribution to the Emerald Tiger kill has been calculated, or they would all have leveled up. However, the only thing they could do was notify. Meanwhile, we meet the leader of the guild. Upon reading the notice, Lee was surprised the level of the this blondie guy right here, who apparently even for the Knights of Leon Hart in the player rankings, and who had ordered as the weakest enemy was level 500 to split up to corner the tiger, and the boss reached. Nonetheless, that had turned out Orkan tried to maintain the formation as many of and prepare and order had lost their lives while protecting the protagonist, and now they did. Lee approached and where the creature they were trying to hunt had gone, the one about being his sword. Nonetheless, at that moment, he received a reply that the enemy was one of the 7 who explained everything and asked if even so he was explaining that the tiger they were hunting had been eliminated by Lee, who had overwhelming power, and in fact, if not for him, he would be dead right now. And just at that moment, the leader learned from one of his men how that boy had been chosen to collaborate on a research project with the head of the Mage Tower. So now they confirmed the rumors that were going around about that boy reaching the conclusion that it was best not to mess with someone like him, since they didn't even know what the limit of his abilities was. But anyway, returning to our protagonist, we see how the latter, thanks to defeating the tiger from before, obtained a reward. Pure emerald crystal unique grade. Of course, even though at that moment that item wouldn't be very useful to them, the protagonist's personality was happy, as he knew that by putting it up for sale, he could get a lot of money for that artifact. Nonetheless, it was no time to celebrate because, immediately, the island's atmosphere changed radically. The whole area emanated a demonic aura, and this message appeared before the boy Kless mission. Birth investigate the evil on the islands. Progress the island began to be stained by greed. Dungeon collapse rate 10%. In fact, this last message reached all the players on the island, who couldn't believe that the collapse rate of the island had started to increase so quickly. After all, barely a couple of days had passed since that zone appeared. By the way, the protagonist deduced that the one responsible for the collapse rate increasing so rapidly must be the demon of greed, so he planned to hunt him as soon as possible. By the way, we see how the protagonist, while continuing to clear the dungeon, could notice how a large part of the players were being affected by the demonic aura that loomed over the place and which, apparently, had been spread by the demon of greed to increase the desire that the players had for the island's treasures, which would very likely end up causing the players to very soon begin eliminating each other. Luckily, the protagonist seemed to know the solution to that problem. He would take possession of all the treasures on the island. That way, no one would have to fight for them. And well, on the other hand, we see how another of the islands had been completely cleared by the rank 1 guild in the rankings. Who, despite the fact that it took them work to eliminate all the beasts, at least they had managed to take possession of that island's treasure. However, besides that, they had to take care of some players who tried to snatch the treasure from them. So now they knew that they not only had to watch out for monsters, but also for the players they might run into, as they would seek to seize the treasures at any cost. By the way, while they were talking about this, they learned that Lee, at that moment, was also raiding on that island, and, of course, the rumor had reached them that now that boy was working directly with the Association of Mages, something that only awakened the interest of the latter even more, not only in meeting him, but also in facing him to know how strong he could really be. Nonetheless, the leader of the guild told them that during this raid, it was best not to face him. Above all, they couldn't risk getting hurt in a battle against him, since they would need all their strength if they wanted to seize the vast majority of the island's treasures. After that, he asked them to set off, since they couldn't allow the rest of the guilds to get ahead of them in finding the treasures. After this, we return to our protagonist who, just like the rest of the guilds, was trying to track the famous treasures before they fell into the wrong hands. Of course, unlike the rest, he was working completely alone, until after a bit of searching, he ended up crossing paths with one of the top-ranked guilds in the rankings. It was the Order of the Lion Knights and, in fact, their commander. As soon as he noticed the presence of Lee, could tell that he was someone powerful, giving him a show of respect and striking up a conversation with him. A conversation that was reciprocated by Lee, since it was the first time someone had used good manners to communicate with him. However, the man was stunned after noticing the brooch that the protagonist was carrying with him. Unfortunately, there was no time for talk, as, at that moment, he was barely able to dodge an attack that would have cost him his life, and which had been the work of this beast right here. The ruler of that island, a kind of giant turtle that raised everything in its path. Giant golden fange turtle. Level 450. Of course, as soon as the knights noticed its presence, they charged at it, trying to eliminate it to take possession of the treasure it might guard. What they didn't count on was that thing, despite its enormous, wondering how he could maintain such confidence, and in just seconds, it was about to crush them. Of course, if not for the protagonist, who ended up saving the knights' lives, using his alchemy. Although for that he had to consume a large amount of his mana. For their part, the knights couldn't believe that this boy possessed that kind of power, and now they were in debt to him for saving their lives. The protagonist had raised a wall out of nowhere, leaving the knights bewildered. Some looked at each other, not understanding what kind of magic that was, but he wasted no time on explanations. He commented that it wasn't the time to talk, since the enemy was still standing. The gigantic turtle prepared to attack again, and the captain ordered the shield bearers to form the defenses. The protagonist thought that he should preserve his humanity, and didn't want to exhaust himself in the middle of combat. At that moment, Harkin, the captain of the Heart of the Lion Knights, turned towards him. He thanked him for his help and made a promise: if he fought with them until the end, the knights would swear to return the favor and would never forget that day. And since it was just what he needed, he of attention had left. He understood that by and ordered his guild they would have more chances of defeating the monster. In the distance, a streamer obsessed with him recorded the scene, satisfied to have captured it. In the chat, they warned him of the danger, but he claimed he was maintaining a safe distance. Meanwhile, the leader of the knights ordered them to advance with honor. The warriors charged forward. While the protagonist analyzed the situation, he observed the monster's movements and concluded that its weak point was in its head, although it would be better to attack the legs first to make the ascent easier. Nearby, Enoch watched him with nervousness. Though grateful for the help, he thought that his captain was exaggerating by swearing loyalty to an explorer, a privilege reserved only for the royal family. Watching the combat, Lee initially thought that the knights were weaker than expected, but soon understood that it was the monster who was just too strong. Their attacks barely caused damage, and since most were short-range fighters, only those in front could attack, while the others waited their turn. If the situation continued like this, they wouldn't win. To make matters worse, the system warned him that the destruction level had reached halfway. He understood that the other players were further ahead than he thought, and that the catastrophe was approaching quickly. While looking for a way to create an opportunity, the turtle roared and hit the ground, triggering an earthquake. The earth split, and from the bottom erupted burning magma. The knights tried to retreat, but firm ground was scarce. In the middle of the chaos, the protagonist had an idea. He remembered the stairs of the mage tower and asked the captain if he was ready to move forward, assuring that he would open a path using the rocks from the terrain, with a staircase that led directly to the monster's head. Everyone was stunned. The knights, their leader, and even the streamer, his character, Grand Bull, of the group, commented that she had only seen something like that in the mage tower, while Enoch couldn't believe an explorer could handle such magic. His doubts grew, but the leader declared that the path was open and that they couldn't waste the opportunity. With time against them, he ordered to advance. The knights ran up the stairs and attacked the weak point of the enemy, causing much more damage than before. In the middle of combat, the protagonist received another system alert. Harken and the knights had waived their share of contribution in defeating the monster, so all the credit went to Lee, who didn't understand why they had done that. After the battle, Harken approached to explain that the brooch he wore was a gift from the Emperor of the Mage Tower years ago. He stated that Lee had saved many lives, and that for that they would always be grateful to him, and the knights offered to fight alongside him whenever he needed it. Just after an energy orb appeared, Lee understood it was the island's treasure, but if he took it, he feared fueling greed, though he knew another player might steal it. The system showed him that the destruction level had already passed halfway, so he had to decide soon. Thought differently without hesitation, he took the treasure. For Granbull, wealth had already grown to full value. As the heir of a noble family, who would enjoy every luxury possible, so avarice did not exist in him. He believed he had found the perfect way to save the island, obtaining the treasure without letting himself be corrupted. Lee was stunned by the difference between the two and questioned if such a thing was really possible. In the distance, Naver watched him. He had noticed his interaction with the knights and thought that Lee could keep collecting treasures, but sooner or later he would have to face him. At that instant, one of Naver's victims tried to get up, muttering that the falcon of the second son would avenge him. Before he died, Naver added his name to the list of players he had eliminated, convinced that that demonstration would be enough to end his enemies. For his part, the streamer continued recording and was excited to see Lee taking the treasure without increasing greed. However, upon inspecting it, Lee felt disappointed. Although it was a mythic object, it turned out to be a broken crown. He thought it must be a joke by the system, but immediately another notification arrived. The Knights of Leonhart had officially joined his party. The captain solemnly declared that from that moment on, he would follow Lee wherever he went, fulfilling the promise made during the battle. The protagonist, who hadn't taken his words seriously, understood then that both Harken and all his knights had really become his allies. Harken stated that he didn't know his goals, but swore to be his sword and his shield within the archipelago. Surprised but satisfied, Lee reflected that he now had the best knights on the continent, and no monster could be a rival for them. In the distance, Never continued watching in silence. One of his men asked him why the level of destruction hadn't changed. Even after Lee took the treasure, Never responded calmly, saying there was nothing to worry about. He explained that although the protagonist was now even stronger and had company, he had already prepared a trap. His plan consisted of attacking when he tried to leave the island. As soon as he got on a boat, a toxin would reach him, and not even the knights could save him. For Never, one hit would be enough to end him, making the treasure something irrelevant. However, just then, Lee looked up at a tree, and Never, who was watching from afar, almost collapsed from the fright. Just with the protagonist's look, he felt a threat so intense that it ran through his whole body. He thought he had been discovered and didn't know how to react. In reality, Lee had only seen a small animal, but Harken warned the protagonist that there was an observer hidden among the trees, which increased Never's terror. After the warning, Lee tried to see who it was, but only managed to distinguish a squirrel and was left confused. His attention shifted when the system notified him that only 2 treasures remained before the total destruction of the archipelago, as he had taken one without increasing greed. He concluded that only one was left for someone else to find. His main concern was reaching it before the others, even though he believed that the destruction would not reach its peak. He knew he shouldn't waste time. Parkin stated he would do as ordered. Meanwhile, Naiver was still so upset. Parkin warned him of a new danger. He believed that Harkin wanted to capture him, but that Lee had let him go, without knowing if it had been out of compassion or preoccupation. In any case, he understood that he had been so close to dying, and decided to abandon the mission. He warned his teammates to stay away from Lee if they wanted to survive. A furious player named Park didn't understand the reason for his change. Yelling angrily and demanding explanations, Naiver had left him alone after asking for an expensive poison. He claimed that he had invested money and even gotten into debt to get it. When one of his men tried to calm him, he replied that it was easy to talk without having put anything from his own pocket. Despite the others' attempts to reassure him, Park accused them of having colluded with Naiver and having made money in secret. He demanded they tell him how much they had obtained. The racket was such that it scared some birds nearby, and the sound caught the protagonist's attention. Parkin asked him if something was wrong, but Lee couldn't be sure. At that moment, he received a new system alert, a danger warning much more serious than the previous ones. His instinct as a demon hunter indicated that something was about to happen. Meanwhile, Park attacked his own allies. One of them, wounded, said that he had always been obsessed with money, but never imagined he would go so far. Park yelled that they had betrayed him, and that everyone had taken money from Naiver. Near there, the streamer, obsessed with the protagonist, remained hidden, recording everything Lee. He managed to capture the exact moment in which Park shouted that he was only taking back what was his. Terrified, the boy ran away as fast as he could. He understood that the rumors about the guild Supernova were true. They really killed players for money. Fearing for his life, he tried to escape in silence, but in his escape, he bumped into another player. To his relief, they were members of the Explorer Alliance. One of them asked him if a monster was chasing him, and the streamer, panting, thought that finally he was safe. He believed that not even someone as crazy as Park would dare to face an entire guild on his own. So he decided to stay with them to feel more secure. Meanwhile, drones flew over the archipelago. It was announced that the territory was divided into 10 islands, each one with a hidden treasure. The method for finding them buried some were easy, others not. The guilds, Shinigami, legends, and explorers had already secured theirs. Only one island remained to explore, where several groups had gathered. Among the first to arrive were the members of Shinigami. They already had 2 treasures. The Korean guild, Gaon, had attained one and was looking for a second. There was also the Inazuma guild, which almost got one, but Gaon arrived first and took it. The rivals, Iken's son and Berserk, were also on the final island. Everyone was waiting to see who would obtain the last treasure. The streamers broadcasted every detail, until something unexpected occurred. The Knights of the Heart of the Lion appeared on the island. No one could believe it. The most powerful warriors of the Empire were there, and their captain, Parkin, was famous for having exceeded level 600. To the lower rank guilds, the situation became desperate, and the surprise was even greater when from among the knights emerged Lee. The protagonist was once again the center of attention. His steady bearing and calm expression projected an unshakable confidence. Even though on the inside he felt nervous, he knew that he would inevitably draw attention. But he couldn't avoid the tension. There are some players who shine like a threat. Others, more prudent, prefer to maintain their distance. What he feared, which would destroy the image of a powerful warrior that the media had created. In the midst of that expectation, the ground began to shake with force, and from the inside of the earth erupted lava, forcing everyone to go on guard. Many tried to flee, but for several it was already too late. Everyone was surprised by the same enemy. The master of the final island, the great lava. A monster level 320, he was suffocating, and the terrain almost impossible to cross. Some chose to stay at a distance. They tried to attack with magic, but a wall of lava prevented the attacks from getting close. Taman wanted to advance, although his brother asked him not to. Meanwhile, in the air the drones showed that not even that tanks could approach because of the fire. In the middle of the chaos, Park approached Lee to apologize for not being of much help. But the protagonist replied calmly there was no reason to worry, as he hadn't come this far without having a plan. For his part, in a situation so dangerous, Lee, without looking away from the monster, knew that magic activation was divided into 3 steps: inspection, interference, and manifestation, and he was clear that it was time to demonstrate it. Lee understood that the lava around the boy was not still, but part of the nature of the place itself. That lava was nothing more than a natural force, as common as the rocks on the ground. With that understanding, the protagonist raised the lava before the eyes of all. Not only those who were present, but also those watching from a distance were left shocked by the feat. If before there already was curiosity about his powers, this act only intensified the mystery. However, the only thing Lee thought about was that his mana was exhausting. Quickly he concluded that Arkan. And as soon as possible, the floating lava passed by the drones, while the streamer focused on the incredible view that he was capturing. Harkin announced that the path was clear, and that it was the knights' turn to do their part. Meanwhile, Lux realized that his lack But they weren't the only ones. The other guilds also began their attack. Tamin's brother warned that there was no possibility of beating a warrior like Parkin and that he must attack first. To their surprise, it jumped and used its own fall as an attack. The explorers thought they were facing a simple fish, but the enemy demonstrated an intelligence that surpassed their expectations. It jumped continually and didn't stay still, making it almost impossible to approach. Even so, something stopped its movements. Spears formed with rock pierced the monster and pinned it against the ground. The heroes could barely distinguish where they came from, until one of them noticed that the protagonist had cooled the lava and turned it into a weapon, without anyone understanding how he had achieved it. That action exceeded the limits of mana imposed by the system. Even so, Lee made a signal to Harkin to attack. With the enemy immobilized and unable to react, it became an easy prey. Although Harkin delivered the final blow, some nearby explorers also received part of the credit for the victory and ordered the withdrawal. In contrast, the spectators celebrated the victory. The monster had finally been defeated. Lee got the highest contribution rate, along with the Leonhardt Knights. For many, his serene face reflected confidence. But in reality, it was pure exhaustion from lack of mana. As the one primarily responsible for the victory, he was given a special object, becoming the island's new treasure. However, right after taking it, everyone was perplexed. The progress marker for destruction didn't appear, and no one understood why. Amid the confusion, a strange aura began to emanate. Shortly after, the indicator finally emerged, though with a delay, signaling that only one level remained for completion. Lee, for his part, reflected that Granville would never develop greed suddenly, so that treasure shouldn't have affected progress like the previous ones. The system confirmed the opposite, greed had increased and a treasure had once again been taken by an ambitious hand. Back in the Explorer Alliance, several members had been eliminated by Park. Moreover, he stole their treasure. The leader of the guild was furious, although when Ali tried to calm him in front of the loot, Park began to feel strange. A headache made him lose control. The demonic capital of greed had possessed him, stripping away his will. That was only possible because of his own avarice, and now his mind was under demonic dominion. The demon assured that he had only helped him get what he desired, and that in return, it was now its turn to get what it wanted. At that moment, someone tried to intervene. The streamer, obsessed with the protagonist, who watched in terror. Soon he noticed that a Leonhardt Knight had arrived, which meant Lee shouldn't be far. The protagonist, for his part, detected the demonic scent in the distance, and wasted no time in heading to the place. The excited streamer announced live the return of the most wanted explorer, but the Knight of Leonhardt informed that the enemy was still alive and asked that Lee give the order to attack. At that instant, the system generated a new mission for him alert. It indicated that the evil of that archipelago was preparing itself, and that he must act immediately. In addition, the stolen treasure remained in the enemy's possession. The system warned that the object was being corrupted by greed and that the protagonist's mission was to stop before the destruction ended everything. With the start of the destruction, many explorers began to fear for their lives. The enemy was revealed as a much more dangerous entity than the monsters defeated before. It attacked with such force that the entire Earth trembled and its size grew to cover almost all the stellar archipelago. The drones recorded the scene, while the streamers noticed that the islands seemed to unite. In the center of that chaos emerged a golden castle, causing surprise to all. Even Lee remained impressed at what he saw. He had never heard of anything like it, and wondered if that castle would also be a treasure, but the system alerted him immediately that was the castle of greed, the nest of one of the 7 deadly sins. The malignant energy of the place was so intense that the protagonist felt that he shouldn't approach. Arkin, for his part, perceived an imminent danger and ordered his knights to prepare for battle. It did not take long before one of the soldiers warned that the ground was full of the living dead emerging from inside. The emergence of the golden castle and of the non-dead drove the streamers crazy as they transmitted with emotion the new content. But suddenly one of them received an urgent message. It was time to celebrate. In the base of the to face it, the protagonist stated that demons existed to be stopped, and that there was no other option. Given that, Harkin observed that in his eyes there was no fear. Although he knew that on the inside the youth was terrified. Determined, the knights gathered and Harkin declared that regardless of what occurred, they would fulfill their oath. Their duty was to help Lee get to the heart of the enemy. The streamers, upon seeing the scene, could not believe it. The path toward the castle is infested with the non-dead, but the knights of Leonhardt kept advancing under the orders of the protagonist. At the base of the personnel observed that despite their warnings, someone had headed toward the castle. Against all expectations, Lee and the knights of Leonhardt marched straight toward the enemies. Everything was transmitted live at a global level. Meanwhile, the tried to isolate the castle to prevent other players from approaching. In the midst of combat, Lee noticed that the knights resisted better than he imagined. They were after all the best on the continent. He focused on recovering his mana so that he could support them very soon. Some explorers thought of joining them. They remembered that they almost died against the lava koi with enemies even more powerful. The result would be the same. For them, this mission was impossible, and it was only a matter of time before Lee fell. The protagonist understood that the non-dead returned time and again. seeing it as useless to try to eliminate them also as humanity was already insufficient. Then, an intense light appeared, surprising everyone, even Lee himself. Taman had arrived to help, and he did not do it alone. The Berserk Guild also joined the combat. That alliance, unexpected, spread immediately through the news, as players from both groups collaborated with the protagonist in front of the palace. Even so, the leaders of both guilds cannot help but clash with each other. Lee observed everything in silence. Although his character, Grambel, stepped forward to speak, he approached the leaders and told them that they must cooperate. That frankness irritated them deeply, for they considered it unacceptable to ask for help in that way. Leonie replied that although she felt in debt to him, she would have preferred a bit more courtesy on his part. Damon's brother commented that this was an opportunity to gain the favor of the protagonist. From the protagonist's perspective, all he saw were two leaders tense and uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the undead fallen began to rise again, and the knights returned to the combat. Taman ordered the clerics to sell themselves to the allies to obtain the divine protection. The protagonist approached Leonie and told her that the Knights of Leonheart also needed a blessing. He added that he had nothing to offer, but he did need her help. In the middle of the struggle arrived more reinforcements. The Saints of Jin announced that they would provide total support so that Lee could fight without worries. Lee was surprised that the rival guild had responded before she had. With the combined help, the knights recovered strength. Lee thanked Taman for her support, and she responded that they would do everything possible to get it, including divine protection. However, Grambel responded with pride that he didn't believe in nonsense like the gods. Lee was enraged internally upon hearing his character speak with such arrogance. Harkin heard the words and was distracted for a moment. At that instant a voice resonated in his mind. He saw a divine figure in front of him and associated it with his majesty, although in reality it was an enemy approaching. Struggling to remain conscious, Harkin warned everyone that the doors of the palace were dangerous and that they must retreat. In his mind, he remembered the day that he made a promise to his emperor. Before him, he had informed that the general demon had been sighted in the wilds of the northwest and asked permission to go there, but the emperor, tired and without hope, responded to him that it's not worth it. Thousands of soldiers would die in vain, weakening the army. Besides, the Tower of Mages that they investigated had fallen in ruins. The inhabitants disappeared without leaving a trace. The emperor confessed that each night, he asked his god if that was the end of the world. But he never received an answer. He stated that even the gods had disappeared. He asked then Harkin if he believed the same, but the knight responded that it was the demons who blocked the path toward the gods. He offered to defeat the general demon to open it again. The emperor, after hearing that, said that he no longer believed in any god. His faith was placed in Harkin, in his strength, and in his will to defeat evil. Back in the present, the battle between good and evil continued. Harkin recovered consciousness and advanced once more. They would do it for his majesty, the emperor who trusted in them. He did not delay in spotting the enemy. The general demon charged toward him. He decided to defeat it, but the demon smiled. It told him that it was already too late. Before Harkin could reach it, a force unknown hit the army.